Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
G'day, how you going? It's Phil Tarrant here. I'm the host of the Smart Property Investment Show. Welcome to this new look, whiz-bang format. I must admit, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. They put me in a slouch chair. I don't know if you can see how good my physique is here, but hopefully I don't look like I'm relaxing too much. But welcome to the show. I hope you're well. And that's for people who are tuning in, watching this across the marvels, that is the interweb, YouTube, where most of you will be tuning into this, or on the social media. But most of you are still just tuning in via the audio broadcast network, that is Spotify or Lipsyn or what do you call it, iTunes or whatever it is, Apple
Podcast,
iTunes. So if you're just tuning in visually, verbally or audioly, I'm trying to paint a picture of our new studio. And I've been rolled out today by our AV team here. They're just tinkering with the studio, making some changes, and they want me to test it out. So I thought I will, number one, do that and help them out because I do like podcasting. Number two, it is a Smart Property Investment Show, so there's a lot that's happening in property and property investment I thought we could give some interpretation analysis on. And thirdly, and most importantly, is introduce you to my colleague, Garman, who is managing editor here. Property now falls within his remit. I've worked with Liam for many years across other aspects of our business. He has a very expansive role here within our editorial team at Momentum. So now he is in charge of editorial about property investment. So in many ways, I sort of report into him.
Well, it's going to be interesting the next few months ahead. So anyone that does have any complaints, send them to liam.garman, not like the GPS, not like the watch, GARMAN at momentummedia.com.au. Yeah. I'll always field complaints, Phil. I'm not above fielding if there's any editorial feedback, but I can't imagine there being too much feedback. We've got an amazing team, a growing team here, 4 journos, actually growing to 5 very shortly. Across real estate, producing podcasts like these that are keeping investors and people in the real estate industry up to date with the big things that are happening and breaking news, day-to-day news, giving them market intelligence and insights that they need to do their job.
Do you count me as one of those journos, or is that
then six?
So you go, am I a journalist? This is the question. Or am I
yes.
Am I the nuisance as part of your reporting line now?
Well, I wouldn't say nuisance in front of your face, but you're digging to get a story. You're digging to find an angle. You're digging to get insights. So I think that is at the core, the crux of what it takes to be a journalist.
So the irony of all of this for our listeners is I report to Liam for the purpose of the Smart Property Investment Show and some of the work that I do across the Property Investment Podcast Network, which includes some other great branded podcasts, like the work I do with Scott O'Neill on Rethink Investing, and Munzrul Khan. We talk about accounting. Paul Glosser, we talk about being a buyer's agent. Victor Kumar on Property Investing Insights of the Right Property Group, a podcast I've done with him for many years. So that's my role inside of the real estate and property portfolio. But the flip side of that you actually report to me as the head of content of the whole company. So there you go.
It's very meta. It's all very meta. But it's jumping into this role, it's been pretty fantastic because you are arming people with really everything that they need to know to be successful in real estate. And one topic that comes up all the time, Phil, is making sure that you're not acquiring property for acquiring sake. You need to align your property investments and what you're buying with a long-term vision, with a financial strategy to set you up for success in the future. Because if you don't, you're just buying a smattering of items, a smattering of different assets for no necessary reason. You're just buying for the sake of buying because you're just herding. There's a herding behavior
and
there.
That's what happens with property investment, is that people They hear about it, they get obsessed by it, and they start buying. And hopefully they don't make too many mistakes. But you got to remember, most Australian property investors own one property. One of the major reasons why is that the first investment property they buy is the wrong investment property. So this is one of many of the things that we've been chatting about for years on the Smart Property Investment Show. But purpose today is that some people might have already heard you on this podcast channel. I've been waiting just a little while to introduce you properly into the podcast. People will be hearing more from you as you lead your editorial team, myself included, around real estate and property investment here at Momentum, which is very successful. It's been doing it great job for many years. And this podcast in particular is many people, it's been a foundational resource for helping them embark on the process of wealth creation through property. So it's really good. But thanks so far for your contribution and participation into the Smart Property Investment Show. You'll be picking up some of my podcasts as well, be a regular face and a very regular voice across the Smart Property Investment Show and some of the other stuff that we do with our guests. So you'll enjoy it, mate.
It's an exciting world.
And you have a passion for property as well.
I do. It's an exciting world, and you can take it really wherever, however and wherever you want to go. You know, so far I've had some fantastic guests on the podcast, unpacking commercial property, commercial real estate, buyers agents unpacking their strategies and the need for research. So just researching areas before you're investing in them. And even our most recent episode, which was with our government relations manager here at Momentum, unpacking what the political climate means for property investors and how much of it is it rhetoric. Yes, the government's come out saying that we're not going to look at negative gearing, capital gains reforms. Fine, we'll take that to the bank, but let's look a little bit longer. Let's look 6 months. Let's look 3 years. We have the opportunity to break down recent results from the LNP, the Queensland election, and what that means for investors. Because looking at the numbers, it seems like a lot of the economic populism that we have seen coming out, especially from the Greens, attacking property investors, saying that you're going to cap negative gearing to one property, or creating a very hostile policy environment for investors. We've seen it. We've seen Greens MPs, Greens senators coming out very much riling up a lot of anger and fomenting a lot of that anger. It hasn't actually really translated into any electoral success. We've actually saw perhaps, or arguably, in southern Brisbane, a retraction in the Greens vote. So looking at that, we had a great podcast. That was only a few days ago. So for our listeners, if you want to listen to that and unpack what the Queensland election meant and what that's going to mean at a broader Australian level, we also looked at the intervention with the government and potential intervention with the RBA and interest rates.
Yeah.
And examples from around the world of, hey, when has artificially lowering interest rates actually been to the detriment of an economy? So do go back and listen to that and feel it's been fantastic so far.
Yeah, no, I do enjoy it. And you're there talking about Steve Cooper and government relations. And you know, this is very much an introduction to all of you who are tuning into this or watching it, to Leanne Garman, my new colleague, who's now joined us on the real estate and property portfolio. Welcome back. It's Phil Tarrant here, host of the Smart Property Investment Show with Leanne Garman, managing editor across many of the portfolios here at Momentum. Now, tell us a little about yourself, Liam. So it sounds as though you're a bit of a political flunky. You like the politics.
For all my sins.
Yeah, and I think one of the, timing is very fortunate sometimes. You are politically motivated and politically aligned, and as are some of our cohort of journalists here, and everyone has a particular political view here, and we are a broad church.
We
in terms
church,
of our editorial
Phil.
team when it comes to views towards politics. We have certain people on the extreme left and certain people on the
We're not going to say extreme right. We're
Some
not going
people
to
who
say
are
that.
just on the right, myself who sit very comfortably in the middle. But a lot of people who tune in this podcast will sometimes hear me start talking about politics. And I think people are going to hear a lot more of that as we enter the forthcoming or upcoming election cycle. I have some views and opinions, and I sometimes share some ideas of how policymakers can think about property as an enabler and shape the way in which they can make it more accommodating for more Australians to get in the property. And I sometimes get a bit vocal on this. And my view, my opinion is property is a fundamental enabler for shaping the health and happiness of all Australians, and therefore Australia in general. That's a very big, broad, bold statements, but you've got to remember what property is. Property is about putting a roof over people's heads, and it's a fundamental expectation of all Australians that they should be able to have a roof over their head, and I think that's a reasonable expectation considering the nation that we live within. Unfortunately, certain people aren't able to achieve that in this particular market. I think there's an obligation on behalf of the government of the day, to ensure that those people who are struggling to find housing are able to realise the support and the help of the government to do so. Social housing, for example, or for those people who may need NDS type style properties or other support. But property also is an asset class for many Australians. So the shape of this podcast, we talk about it through the lens of property investment. Now, I would say that certain cohorts of the Australian public would listen to some of the conversations on the Smart Property Investment Show and find it abhorrent that people sit there and talk about property investment. And I do recognise and acknowledge that. Most people that tune into this podcast do it for the purpose of wealth creation. So this podcast is the lens of how you can do that most effectively through property investment. But that doesn't dismiss and it does not acknowledge some of the struggles that people have when it comes to the fundamental rights to have housing in Australia. So we try and have a comfortable relationship with that, where we will talk about property as an asset class, how to go about doing it as well as you possibly can, but still acknowledging the rights and the obligations of certain people for that. So we need to have a healthy dissection of those two things. And just because we're talking about people making money out of property never dismisses the thought or the process that we have here as an organisation and also individuals around it as a fundamental need for most people to have a house over their heads. So, and hopefully property investors can help ameliorate that or be a participant of it. Only sort of some numbers I shared recently, maybe not on this podcast, but 100 years ago, half of all Australians rented. So this idea of the great Australian dream and property ownership being a right of everyone, it's a relatively new thing. It's mainly sort of post World War II that you saw this acceleration of home ownership in Australia. In other parts of the Western world, you saw the same thing in America, for example. So this, at the moment, a third of Australians-ish rent, and the rest sort of either own their own home outright or they have a mortgage against it. So property investment is a big part of the Australian economy. It's, in many ways supporting the health and the strength of our banks. Our banking institutions are fundamental to the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really interesting place we live in, but we sometimes get political on this podcast, and I think that's right. And our views towards politics is we play the ball and not the man.
Well,
It's pretty much how we frame it.
I think it's fair to say you can be political. Everything has to be political. It doesn't mean that we have to say go out and vote for this person. We're not talking about political in that sense. If you're in a commercial or retail bank, you'd still have teams and teams and teams of people researching political risk.
Yeah.
If you're in a fund, you would have probably even more teams and teams and teams of people researching political risk. Imagine you were a commodity trader and you didn't factor in a Russian invasion of Ukraine. You would probably be out billions of dollars in the movement of commodity prices because you didn't factor in politics. You can't divorce politics from investment. You can't divorce politics from economic gain. And so we have to, by reasoning of allowing people to give them the tools to get on the property ladder, we're talking about the ethics of property investment. I would also say there are thousands of people that have listened to this podcast who didn't make a bad investment because of the lessons that they learned on this podcast.
I'd like to think so.
Of course, there would be, because even as I've begun familiarising myself with the Smart Property Investment Show, there are some pretty common lessons that are coming out, which I'm still learning about. Yeah. And I'm sure with a lot of guests that you're interviewing that you still learn every day.
I get that. It's probably one of the, if you're into property investment, and there's a lot of people who are absolutely obsessed by it. They love it. It consumes every waking moment about what next, what am I going to do, whatever. And there's a lot of people who wired that way, and I get to meet a lot of them. It's a real privilege. But I have one of the great jobs in Australia when it comes to property investment, because I can pick up the phone to anyone. Anyone. We had a former Prime Minister in the office here just the other
24
day.
hours ago.
24 hours ago. Anyone. And just go, what do you reckon about this? What's going on? And it's a great place to be. So for me, it's a perpetual mechanism of learning and shaping my opinion around property. And my job as a host of this podcast, as you as well, is just to help shape conversations with people who are much more informed and smarter than we are, to help people make more informed decisions. That's the basis of this podcast. A lot of people go, Phil, you know everything. I don't know anything. Really, I don't really know that much about property, but I know how to talk to people about property for them to give me really good information.
I know how to ask the right questions
that I can share with our audience, right? And that's the basis of what we do. And by doing that, you actually do end up knowing quite a lot about property. I don't know where to invest. People go, where should I invest? I don't know. Just go. Here's all these people that know much more than me. Go and speak to them. Yeah. Right? It's a bit of a cop out, right? But it's good. So I telegraphed this well over 6 months ago, probably even towards the start of this year, that the upcoming election is going to be fought and potentially won on housing policy. amongst one or two other key things,
Yeah,
right?
look-
And you see it emerging. You saw it coming out of the state election in Queensland just last weekend. And you spoke about some of the swings. There's a huge swing against the Greens. Labor's happy about that because essentially they're at war with them over their housing policies and stuff getting blocked, going into the Senate around changes around that. It is fracturing Australian politics at the moment. Housing. We've seen the coalition come out with their housing policy only a couple of weekends ago, which is going to be a way in which they're going to be stimulating the supply side, which I think is quite smart. It's supply and demand. You see the housing issue, crime and housing, I think was a key driver of shaping the election up in Brisbane. So, every Australian, it's a democracy, has the privilege to place their vote on how they think they're going to put whoever's going to be in place to make the best decisions. And I think a lot of that is going to be shaped around housing policy moving forward.
Yeah, I think a lot of
coming into this show, the point is, you coming into the show is that we get to lean on some of your political acumen, which is much more advanced than mine. I'm just a bloke that goes down to Canberra and speaks to politicians and occasionally have a beer with them, right? You actually know what you're talking about. You actually get the fundamentals of politics. So I'm going to be leaning on you for commentary around this, along with your colleague, Government Relations or Affairs Manager Steve Cooper, when it comes to this, because it's important. It's going to drive and shape the election. Thankfully, I think they're going to leave negative gearing alone, which I've said the whole time around. They're not going to touch that.
I don't think they will. In terms of it shaping the election, I think you're right. I think you're right. Now, obviously, you can see where an election battleground is going to be fought based off of key vote drivers. Yeah. Now, I think housing is a fractured issue because I think an element of people's concern about housing, a lot of it will actually be tied into people's whose response for their key vote driver is immigration, because they'll be looking at from a demand side. From cost of living, if you're a renter, you would roll that into the cost of living. So I think there's a reasonable argument that you could say housing is its own vote driver, coupled with a large chunk of cost of living, coupled with a large chunk of people whose vote driver is immigration. You're covering the supply and the demand sides of both of those curves in those three. I think if you sum them, yes, it probably will be the key vote driver for a decent number of Australians. And this is where we get political again, because you can't divorce politics and the economy. One thing that has surprised me has been the willingness for the Greens and certain members of Labor to want to be more interventionist with the RBA. Now, yes, I worked in politics and, I studied finance. So not that I'm a mathematical genius at this, but I'm well read enough to know off the top of my head multiple instances in the world where federal governments and elected governments have gone to war with central banks to artificially lower interest rates, and you have the unintended outcome happen. Off the top of my head, I can pick Erdogan in Turkey, still current president, who came in and lowered interest rates. And what that meant was inflation went off, the value of the Turkish lira collapsed. So what does that mean for the economy? Well, the cost of your imports are just going to skyrocket. That means your cost of living has actually gone up more. It becomes that self-fulfilling cycle, right?
Yeah.
You can think about it with Argentina as well. Similar things happen there with a peso, similarly decline in value. The cost of your imports go up. Now, it almost stymies. It's shocking for people who have read economic history, even just within the last 20 years. We don't need to go back to Smith. Even in the last 20 years, how many times this happened and failed? And there will be unintended consequences for going to war with the RBA, because the RBA has its mandate, which is employment levels and inflation. Now, the RBA itself has come out saying, well, the key driver of inflation at the moment is government expenditure. That was reflected by a fair number of Australia's banks. That's been reflected by a fair number of Australia's large accounting firms. There seems to be most people in the financial world are in lockstep with this, that a lot of it is driven by government.
You even had the RBA government
policy.
coming out probably was a month or two ago, pretty much saying government policy around rebates and incentives around electricity is inflationary, right?
Of course it
even
is.
though they come out saying it wasn't. Now we saw the inflation figures only come out recently, and it's within the RBA target range now.
Yeah, because it's been artificially lowered. Now, but while that is good for a headline, it's a great headline. And if you're, I mean this with the greatest amount of respect, if you're an uninformed voter, and I mean a voter which might glean a headline or might watch Channel 7 News and get 30-second soundbite of it, it's great. Australia looks like it's back on track, but it is artificial. If you look at Australia's long-term bond yields, every bond trader is saying, well, no, actually, inflation's here to stay, and maybe we're looking at further interest rate hikes.
Yeah,
that's what our bond traders are thinking.
I'll tell you what, the government doesn't want anyone talking about that, and this is the key issue. And what I think where politics sometimes get politics, as in the aggregate of the political class in Australia, is that I think sometimes they think Aussies are dumber than what they are. And I don't know if this is a fair comment, and I'm sure people will criticise me for this. But they try and dumb it down to sound bites that they think the average Joe or Mary or whoever are going to get. And Australians are smarter than that, right? Like it gets dumbed down. Everyone uses glib terms all the time to try and paint this political picture. This is political spin, you know the game, right? But Australians are a lot smarter than that, right? And as we enter this election, both sides of politics, so the government and the opposition, and then you've got your more sort of fringe groups, whether they're, fringe probably not the right term, but allies like your Greens or your independents, right? Those that are able to connect with the Australian populace and have sensible, smart and informed decisions, treating Australians as in they're not dumb, are probably those that are probably going to do the best, right? That there's a hot tip, right? Welcome back, Phil Tarrant from Smart Property Investment with Lee and Garman, introducing you to the podcast and some of the political discussion we're going to have. And the good thing about this podcast is, back to my original point, we'll cover the stuff that matters at any point in time. And you don't invest, to your point, you don't invest in property in a bubble. It's not in a vacuum, right? There are certain things you can control as a property investor. We talk about them on the show. These are strategies and tactics and how you go about finding properties, renovating properties, adding value to properties, managing yourself, all that structural, mechanical, tactical and strategic stuff you can do as a property investor to shape the best outcome for yourself. But you're also operating an environment that you have very little control over. I do say everyone gets the vote, might not necessarily go in your favour. So you need to be operating in an environment where you don't know what's going to be happening with interest rates. You don't know what's going to be happening with inflation. You don't know what government of the day, state, local or federally, is going to put in place to change the game or the rules of investing in property. So there's a lot there to risk.
Change on a dime.
Change on a dime. We only saw, recently, Victoria and even Brisbane imposing a whole bunch of, Queensland imposing a whole bunch of new property taxes. You just got to wear it. You can't go, no, I don't want to participate in that. I'm out. Like, you got to suck it up and get on with it. So that's the reason why the tactical and the strategic stuff matters, because you've got to be preparing for all these things. But as we enter the upcoming election, Australians are smarter today. Australians are a lot more connected with their finances. We know from the global financial crisis that Australians now take a lot more responsibility for their money. It's not like, someone else will work that out, that's someone else's job. No, this is the reason why a lot of Australians are so far ahead in their mortgages. They are planning for a rainy day. They are ensuring they've got buffers and stuff in place. And hopefully, this podcast has played its very small part in helping shape the right character and behaviours for property investors right across Australia. But we're going to talk a lot more about this. What I do sometimes chat about on this podcast, and good thing is that we can talk about anything. I'm happy to talk to anyone about anything as long as I can go, what do you do? How does that impact property? Let's have a formal discussion around it so we can give people more insights. We work quite closely together in other parts of this business, and some people might not know, but as well as the stuff I do in property, I'm sort of quite heavily involved in a lot of our defence and national security stuff here at Momentum, which is cybersecurity as well. Space, cyber is key. So I often start having discussions around. I try and temper it a bit because you don't want to, sometimes it's too much. But the consequences of the security environment Australia's spot in the world, and how that actually manifests into shaping property investment decisions making, whether or not it's around government spending with defence and national spending and how it's going to shape property markets. We're talking about now AUKUS Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which is going to be about Australia securing
There'd be a
nuclear
few
power
new hotspots
submarines.
around Adelaide and Perth with that.
Yeah, well,
That's
you know,
for sure.
I was chatting with someone in this business who reckons Port Kembla is still a hotspot for you know who I'm
I think that
talking about
individual
here.
needs to taper his expectations. I'm sure Port Kembla will keep growing, but I don't think it's going to be the defence hotspot that he
You don't
that he
think
hopes.
they're going to be so? But this is how all these government spending and decision making around defence is shaping property markets, right? Like, and this is what happens. You know, where a government's putting their infrastructure spending has a consequence for property markets. Where they're, you know, we've got a new tube here, if they want to call it, metro. It's changing and shaping property markets. So it's good to be able to have all these discussions. We do a podcast together, and to give it a little plug, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, called Contest the Ground, where we actually look at the security environment for Australia. We acknowledge that there is conflict taking place, but it's below the threshold of kinetic conflict. It's grey zone warfare. We talk about misinformation and disinformation. We talk about foreign interference. We talk about influence operations,
Financial security
and fuel security and food security and all these issues, which all have, you know, you can extrapolate it out and have consequences for the property market in Australia. Every story in Australia has a property angle to it. And that's makes this sometimes quite fun.
No, that's it. Literally brings in everyone.
Yeah.
In one way or another, and I think it is an exciting place to be.
What have you learned so far about property in the sort of month or so you've been hiding you away? I know you've done a couple of podcasts, but I haven't formally introduced you.
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
What have
What's been your favourite conversation so far, other than this one, obviously?
other than this one, shout out, go and watch the Smart Property Investment Show with Jo Vadillo, my amazing sister. That was a soft landing for one of my first podcasts.
I've met your sister. I actually interviewed her before you even started working here.
That's true.
Is that before you started working here?
Well before. Years before.
Because I met her at your wedding.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's cool.
Years before. So,
how's she? What's her business's name again? I don't want to give her a plug or anything.
Advocate Property Services.
But how did she end up? I can't remember the back. We'll have to get it back on at some point in time. How did she end up being a buyer's agent?
Well, she loved property.
Okay.
She was a property investor. That's where it started.
Yeah.
And then the buyer's agency came after that.
Okay. She'd been at it for a few years, right?
Yeah,
She's not
for
one of these
a long
sort of-
time. Yeah, for a long time.
Before it became a cool thing to do.
Well, she did have a bit of a hatchet job I'm not going to say the masthead, but a journalist called her up for comment and then did the old switcheroo and made the entire story about her. And it was a bit unfair because the story was...
Do you know what? You'd be surprised how often journalists do that. Property is fair game. So, and you see it all the time, property investors and property investment professionals, you speak to most of them, and most of them will have had a negative experience talking to the media.
That's the amazing thing, because obviously, I mean, there's a level of venom, right, with the whole I've done it, you can do it too. Sure that the gap is bigger, but the advice was still advice. She gave advice for first home buyers or first time investors on how they can do it too. The very tangible advice, researching what area you think will be a growth area, the speculation side, balancing it with yields, basic stuff that all of our listeners would know and know about very well, but your first time investor might not. And from that, it became a very venomous story, and I feel sorry for her, but there was...
segments of the media love beating up property and property investment.
I think at last check, it was like 5,000 comments on the story on Facebook. Yeah, it went viral. I think 5,000 comments.
All publicity, good publicity?
Well, she ended up getting a lot of messages.
Supporting?
No,
negative. So pretty much going, people like you,
people emailing
wreck it for us, we can't buy homes because of
people,
you. All
a lot of swearing.
Stuff. There was a story recently on the ABC with Victor Kumar, and you go and tune into it. I sort of did a debrief with him on air.
Where they cut it.
And you can tune into it in the most recent episode of a Property Investing Insights of Right Property Group, which you can listen to on this podcast network. And we touched on it briefly. We didn't dwell on it. Like he's been at this for a couple of decades. He's got a large portfolio, 100+ properties, which is not the norm. Yeah. He's got a great migrant story arriving in Australia, and he's seen the benefits of property investment. Now, most people who tune into the Smart Property Investment Show would go, "Wow, that's something I'd like to emulate." But this cohort, this community that tune into this podcast is not representative of how a lot of parts of Australia think, right? And this comes back to the point, it's a very polarising and therefore politicised aspect of Australia. This is the way it is, right? We don't need to go over that. We're going to have lots of fun as we run up to elections around it. But, you see the venom and the militant attitude that you have some element. I'm talking specifically around the Greens here. They're losing favour and losing currency with part of their traditional voter base because of their militant attitudes to all this.
Hell yeah, they are.
Particularly boomers and Xers who in inner city environments, I think you see a swing in Brizzy around it. But as a result of it, they're going to be, that they're being very militant around this, and I think they're to get political for one moment, the with the cost of living, I want to talk about the cost of living crisis, but the cost of living crisis, there's a swing of their cohort away from energy and climate change being the primary thing to, hang on a sec, I still need to buy my caramel milk latte and avo.
What were they
on
called?
toast,
Tree
right?
Tories.
Tree Tories.
A lot of your kind of traditional Labor socialists, they call them tree Tories because they the more affluent Greens that had the discretionary spending to care about the environment.
Yeah, and they're all swinging now away. Maybe to more independence, but this militant, I don't think the militant views of some spokespeople inside a party is a positive force for Australia. No. Now, the counter that people say, well, you've got all podcasts like this and all these people talking about property investment, trying to champion it, trying to indoctrinate other people and make it even harder for Australians to buy property. It's not beneficial, it's not helpful. Structurally, we need to remember there's two major stakeholders as a property investor that you can largely rely upon. The Australian government, because the Australian government doesn't want to be in the business of providing rental property to all Australians. First point. And secondly, the banks. And the banks need to return shareholder value. Banks are in the business of lending mortgages to people that can service a mortgage. So therefore, if you can service a mortgage and you can be responsible in your borrowing, your ability to pay a mortgage, you can actually use it as a strong partner. It's called leverage. Most people, 90%, 80% when they start investing in property LVRs, the bank is a very powerful partner for you investing in property, even though myself included sometimes like to beat banks up. So this is the backbone of property markets in Australia.
And the data is pretty clear by this point. And again, I know, how many disclaimers can we put on this, ethical about it, but the data is very clear that you do need property investors to drive supply.
Yeah.
The modelling that came out, I think from Deloitte following suggestions that the government was going to look into negative gearing. Now, at the end, it was only a direction to review negative gearing, but the data was clear that, that will reduce supply, which in the long run will just mean higher house prices anyway. Gosh, how many different prices am I looking at? Cost of living world. But that it will lead to higher house prices in the long run.
Well, a lot of the view now, and I was reading, it was a good piece, it was in the AFR this week, property investment will be self-regulating. And I've sort of always thought this view. It didn't, the journal, I can't remember his name, didn't frame it this way, but property investment is self-regulating. So this particular piece pretty much said that we've probably hit the peak of property investors in Australia. It's going to start waning, and that's a structural issue. Some of the
data
reasons
is indicating that at the moment
data is indicating because you have your younger investors are less likely to be investing in property as an asset class because it's a lot more, in inverted commas, unaffordable these days, even though you can argue against that. But, by and large, so your boomers largely, and then Gen Xers are your biggest cohort of property investors who have been at it longer, are more invested, probably have greater capacity to buy property, and they're living longer, and they're not liquidating their property investments because as soon as you sell a property investment to realise cash from it, you have to pay capital gains on it. So they're doing whatever they can to hold on to their property investments, and they're living off the income created by it. So you're going to end up with a lot more generational portfolio development moving forward. So what will end up happening, I believe, is that more people will die with properties that are investment rather than selling them off to sustain a lifestyle. So there's going to be mixes of that, right? But and that's going to cascade down, I think, generationally through. And now the way that people are holding properties in trusts and stuff, they've got good asset estate planning around it. So they're not going to be selling their properties. They're going to be holding firm because they don't want to realise the tax consequence of it. And younger people are less likely to invest in property because of some of the requirements now to invest in it in terms of savings and everything else, the serviceability and that sort of stuff. And interest rates, to your point, probably going to be higher for longer. We're not going back to 1.92% interest rate. So property investors probably hit its threshold, right? It's probably where it's at. And you see the growth in loan books. It was tempered by banks, by APRA, the regulatory body, back in 2016, 2017, I probably get those numbers right, pretty much saying stop growing your investment book as fast as what you were. Some of them were growing super fast. Now that's really tempered down and it's got a natural equilibrium. So the property investment market as it is right now is probably as a percentage about where it's at, right? We still need to provide housing for Australians.
Yeah.
So as a percentage, it's important that property investors still do it. And this is a friendly audience, right? That people go, yeah, I'm making money out of it, and I'm also providing depends how altruistic you are, a civic duty of providing housing for Australians. Not always a theme agreed to, but
we'll get a Green Centre on here, Phil.
Yeah, we would. Well, you know, and if the Greens are tuning into this, I'd love. Who's the Green spokesperson? Chandler.
That
Chandler
one.
Mather.
Max,
Chandler.
yeah.
Max.
Yeah, him.
Max double barrel last name.
Yeah.
If he wants to come and have a chat with us, I'd really enjoy it. You know, and we could talk about these things. Do you know what I did do though?
Oh no!
Do you know what I did do?
That always worries me.
No, I had some fun. I was with our government affairs, GR. We got GR.
We're a government. I don't know. I guess I've never been consistent with it.
Yeah.
GR. Well, GR is the term. Yeah.
Anyway, we spent about half an hour picking through the parliamentary register of disclosure around assets.
Oh, good-o. There'd be some fun finds in there.
There was really, and you know, we were looking at we looked at Turnbull.
Yep.
We looked at Albo. We looked at Dutton. We looked at some of the other folks who we know. And it's funny how very few, some pollies do invest in property, but some of them, and we looked up the Green spokesman, nothing. I think he had a savings account with Bendigo Bank or something. I can remember. Like you look at it and just go, there's no assets, right?
Yeah.
You know. And is this for the purpose of like going, I'm like every Australian and struggling through the cost of living, which is the mantra of the Greens, saying property investors are pushing up property prices, or, and it comes back to the point, Australians are a lot smarter than what they used to. The numbers highlight now a lot of Australians are property investors. You know. So anyway, get back to the politics. Cost of living crisis. I'm not happy with the term.
You don't like it?
Well, it's not a crisis. It's just the cost of living.
I say cost of living crisis.
Yeah, but this comes back to the point, like, you know, maybe before the last break, pollies throw around and saying cost of living crisis, housing crisis, cost of living crisis, it's not a cost of living crisis if there's always a cost of living increase.
The growth's higher than it was previously.
Yeah, but it's like, how's that going to dissipate? Like, what policy is anyone going to put in place to change the frame of going? Is there an acceptance now that it's going to get more? It's going to be more expensive.
Well, I've got a few ideas.
Like what?
Cuts.
Cut what? Interest rates.
Like like fiscal cuts. I mean,
small government rather than big government?
We've got
most of the job growth is coming out of the government spending money.
But so we don't like the term cost of living crisis, but there is higher than usual cost of living growth
compared to
over the last 2 decades, 3 decades.
Yeah.
And basically every economist worth their worth has said that is due to government expenditure, creating jobs that aren't necessarily meant to be there. There would have been a bigger market correction had the government not stepped in. What we have very unfortunately, and this isn't in defence of property investors, but what we have very unfortunately is prolonged time of higher interest rates because we have misaligned fiscal policy and monetary policy. I mean, if you were looking at the government's books now, not knowing the politics that's gone on around it, not knowing the economic world that's gone on around it, you're looking at the government's books now, you would say, oh, they must have come out of a deep, deep recession and they're trying to spend their way out of a deep, deep recession, thinking, say, Greece in 2008 or Great Recession in the 1930s. That's not the case. This is just fiscal silliness. We're putting heat in an engine which
so if there was
hot.
a change of government, would the cost of living slow?
No, because I don't think the coalition has the wherewithal to cut. They didn't cut.
This is the point I'm making.
They didn't cut in 2013.
And this is the point I'm making. It's not a crisis. That's normal.
Oh, okay.
You know, yeah.
No,
I'm just saying we need to normalise.
So, but okay,
we need to normalise the cost.
It is abnormal, but if you're saying that we need to normalise it, given that this point forward, because we're spending so much money that it's going to keep growing at this rate, then yeah.
But this comes to the point. Australians need to know that if you think it's a crisis, most people think crises can be overcome or crises can be resolved or crises will go away. If this is the way it's going to be, right, what we need to be doing is it's going to be more expensive to live.
But it doesn't have to be.
No, but therefore, you probably want to make some structural changes to how you are living.
Yeah.
Right? Then it's not a crisis. If you can manage your family balance sheet by spending less, which is what the government should be doing anyway, not spending, you've got to align yourself with the environment that you operate within. And this is the point. It's not a crisis if you're managing it. Now, there's two sides to that, right? There's proper crises that people going like, we can't afford to eat. Right? That needs to be looked at. But middle Australia, right, it might mean less holidays. It might mean not upgrading your house. It might mean not getting a new car. It might mean not having the latest technology in your pocket. It might mean all these different things. It needs to be a tempering of attitudes around how you choose to live your life. You can move yourself out of a crisis, if that's the case, by making some tough decisions largely. I'm talking about middle Australia. I'm not talking, there are certain structural elements of the Australian population who are really struggling, and that needs to be, and that is the obligation of the government to fix that, right? I'm talking about everyone with a good job, everything they do. It might not mean living within 5 kilometres of the CBD.
No, Phil, you can't say that.
It might mean moving to another state where it's cheaper to live, right? Like, you can't just blame the government for the crisis. People here are investing in property, and a lot of them I know and I talk to, they're doing very, very well out of it because they're able to set themselves in their own finance with the choices that they make. And for many people, they go without, particularly a lot of property investors new to it. They go without, they delay choices as a result of trying to get ahead.
Yeah, they delay
and this
the
is who we
gratification.
typically speak to on this particular podcast, right? And again, I want to make the point, there is aspects and certain aspects who they're struggling. It's really, really tough, and I know some of them personally. It's horrible, right? Everyone else, maybe balance your expectations.
On that note, I think our producer told us to.
Yeah, I saw our little hourglass was only about 5 minutes. So
Anyway, I don't think our hourglass went for an hour.
But we need to get some guests in. I want to debate these things. The cost of living crisis.
Oh,
Don't promise Australians.
With crisis,
don't
Phil.
promise Australians that the crisis is going to be magically gone.
Oh, it can be.
No, the government's got obligations and they've got some ways, some settings they can do it. But you've got to look at how
Phil,
you can
give
set
me the
yourself
keys
around
to the
it.
Treasury.
You want them?
Yeah, give me the keys to the Treasury. I'll fix it within a day.
That's what Trump would do.
Oh, well, look,
We've got a whole podcast. We're going to talk about the election. And
my biggest learning of the last, it's not a decade now, it's just ticked over a decade, the 2013 budget, where everyone in Australia, and this, we're getting political here, quote unquote, but everyone in Australia is saying, the Abbott hockey cuts. Anyone who said that didn't read the budget. You can get the budget papers. That was just a lie. Everything went up. The only thing that was cut was forward projections because instead of the different departments getting a 10% boost, they got a 2 or 3% boost. By the way, which every retiring government does in their forward projections when they know they're going to lose, and they leave mine after mine after mine in forward projections. So then when the next government comes along and they can't commit to it, they finger point. Yeah. That's normal in politics. They've done it for years.
You've got to stop being politicians and politicking and look at how do we structurally change things in Australia, particularly around housing. And there's a simple answer, and it's a motherhood issue, is that you need to build more dwellings faster, and it's an uncomfortable conversation that Australians don't want to hear about. It might not necessarily be your own house in the suburbs on a quarter-acre block, which is a dream of the 50s and the 60s. It could be high-density apartment living. That's the stuff that needs to get built. We need to make sure that the right incentives are put in place to support development and ensuring that we've got the right people in Australia in order to do that, which is probably going to mean, unfortunately, for some people, more people choosing Australia as their home who are skilled workers that can help there. Then you've got the union movement to deal with who don't want that. So again, another complication. That's how you fix the cost of living crisis. More housing.
More housing.
There you go. Whoever's tuning into this, simple.
Direct your complaints to liam.garman at momentummedia.com.au.
Welcome. This is the Smart Property Investment Show.
Yeah, thank you,
This is
Phil.
it. You know, we're happy to talk about this. A lot of people just go like, and you know the beauty about podcasting also say this is just my view on any given day.
It's opinion.
You know, it's an opinion, right?
Well,
like I sit here sometimes, I might change. I hear something new and I go, I'll change my opinion.
Yeah.
You know? And podcasts are really forgiving. That's what I said. I said that 2 months ago. I don't believe that anymore.
Yeah,
I've changed now because I got new information. So it's a moment in time is what I think.
Yeah.
And it's organic. It's not scripted.
No, it's not. But also, it's idea generation.
It is.
It is idea generation.
But editor at smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, still work to goes to you?
Yes, yep.
Okay. No hate mail. It's all okay?
Well,
not yet.
Not until this
yet.
goes out. So I'll give it 48 hours.
So if anyone tuning into this is connected in with the Greens, our government relations people are obviously speaking to them, but they're a bit hesitant and come on. Come and have a chat with us. Come and speak to Australia's property investment
Community.
sector. Yeah, there's I don't know, a couple of 100,000 people tuning this a month. There's a lot of people listen to it. You know, they're property investors, right?
Yeah.
You know,
A couple 100,000.
it's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
You know, come and have a chat with them, and they're reflective of what you expect and what you hear. And sometimes the rhetoric coming out there, they're your mum and dad investors, your doctors, your nurses, your healthcare workers, your ambos, your tradies. A lot of tradies invest in property. Like, you know, it's the core and the heartbeat of the Australian population who invest in property.
Oh, that's what we've spoken about at length, Phil. You know, a lot of some of Australia's biggest jobs that the property investors that have property investors, emergency services and military, because they move around.
Yeah.
So you buy your family house and then you get posted somewhere else, then suddenly it's no longer your family house.
Lots for us to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you,
Always
Phil.
good. Nice to see you, Liam. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.